Hmm. Oh, hi. I'm Cinegeek. Have you ever had trouble figuring out how to start or approach a project? It's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, especially since reflecting on my last video. Speaking of which, before I get too far into the topic of this video, I wanted to say thank you to everyone who watched my Make Something video. I wasn't expecting for it to resonate with people as much as it did, and it means a lot to me that my message was able to do so. I apologize if I haven't been able to respond to everyone. It's been difficult to parse through everything, but I really have loved the messages from people sharing the things that they've been making. It makes me a lot more hopeful for the future, so I just wanted to say keep making and sharing what you're doing. It is important. Anyways, I thought I'd expand a bit more in my previous video, showing some application of the research and development phase of creation. In particular, the process of making a foundation that something can grow from. This is something that is personalized to each person's particular interest, and I believe it can be applied to most creative endeavors. I'll be focusing on one particular medium for this project just to show what it's like to apply this methodology. In the end, you yourself will choose your own focus, and imagine mine is more of a surrogate in this case. All right. Now to decide what to make. So how I start is by asking myself, what do I want to make? Depending on my headspace and interest at the time, this can vary quite a bit, and starting from nothing can be quite difficult. Unless I have an epiphany in a moment, using its momentum to push myself forward, it can be hard to make that feeling come out of nothing. So in this case, I decided to reference my sketches and personal work to see if anything I'd made before stood out to me. I've done this quite a few times in the past, and it's a great way for me to get started. Basically, I go through any unused characters, sketches, or just ideas I've held on to or made in a moment, and then expand them into something larger. In this way, I'm using my own previous work as a direct reference, a way that lets me use the momentum of something that already exists. There were a few different pieces and concepts I considered, but in the end I found myself drawn back to a piece I made last year of a character named Kyra. I'd originally made this as a concept for a video game character. I was inspired to make it at the time because I was very into the game Nine Souls, and was thinking about if I made my own game, what the main character would be like. Looking at the piece again, I immediately got inspired, and the potential of the character started to shine for me. Since I could feel myself getting excited, this felt like a good start, so I decided to use it as a base for this project. Now, using this design as a starting point, I decided that since it was a concept for a video game character, that building a concept for a video game made the most sense. To begin, I started researching different games I'd enjoyed in the past, particularly ones with 2D animation style or aesthetic, since those were the ones I found the most appealing and in a similar style to the character I made. In the end, I found the side-scroller and Metroidvania genres were what made the most sense for me in this context. To explain quickly the concept of a Metroidvania, since I'm not expecting everyone to know what that is, it's basically an open world, in this case 2D side-scrolling game, where you unlock more paths and locations as the story progresses. Its origin comes from the Metroid and Castlevania franchises and how a majority of their games played. A big part of these games is power-ups and increased mobility over time that create a more complex gameplay throughout the experience. I've very much enjoyed this genre in the past and have found the growth, exploration, and gameplay to be extremely appealing in most cases. With my artistic base, medium, and genre figured out, I then decided to choose a game that would be my main reference for this project. This would be something that would be an example of a game in the genre I felt was successful and that I would attempt to study and learn the most from. To clarify, I wouldn't be looking to copy this game bar for bar. I would be looking to use it as a masterwork and example for this project. I believe doing this can be incredibly helpful, since you are studying something you greatly admire in your chosen medium. So for my main reference, I decided to use what had been the main inspiration for the art piece in the first place, Nine Souls. So I've played Metroidvania games since I was a kid, and I've always had a soft spot for the genre. Many have been some of my favorite experiences in gaming throughout the years, but also have been in many cases a bit imperfect in regards to my own tastes. I've very much enjoyed games like the Hollow Knight, Ender, Ori, and Castlevania DS games, and many more, but the experience of playing Nine Souls immediately stood out to me amongst them. It had a narrative that drew me in with fun, fluid combat that was flashy and focused on parrying, with gameplay that felt super polished in general. It felt like a mixture of Sekiro and Hollow Knight, taking the best parts of both games, something I found extremely compelling. It also did something I found few Metroidvanias have done for me in the past, which is get me interested in the narrative. I've found Metroidvania games in general to just sometimes not have the strongest story or just have difficulty telling that story. And I've found many bosses and encounters in other games in the genre just haven't really sold me on their place in the story as well. Also, many stories have relied on interacting with NPC characters to find more info, or in general have just had more ambient storytelling. Both of those are fine, but have led to me in many cases just playing a game for gameplay's sake, instead of connecting with the story and motivation of the characters. This isn't necessarily bad. I think there are many games that I genuinely love that have narratives that just don't appeal to me. But Nine Souls was very different in this experience for me. It focuses on characters and storytelling as much as the gameplay, using a visual novel and comic format to balance telling a story between the action. It is also importantly a revenge story, one where the main character, Yi, is on a mission to destroy every one of the bosses in the game out of a personal vendetta. This fits quite well in an action game as a motivation, especially when boss encounters are one of the main appeals of the gameplay. Throughout the game, you learn who these bosses were and why Yi wants to, or in some cases needs to, take them on. This made it so that when you finally got to a fight with a particular character, I felt invested, making me want to fulfill Yi's relationship towards them. This showed me how in a boss-based game, focusing on revenge and the individual characters' relationships towards the individual bosses could really make an appealing narrative in this kind of genre. It's a combination of this kind of storytelling and gameplay that made me really admire what Nine Souls had done. So with my initial art, medium, genre, and main reference decided upon, I moved on to the research phase. For research, especially on a visual project, I find that visual boarding / note-taking is a lot more useful than standard notes, especially in this case. I find most of the time arranging work in a more standard document can easily get out of control and can lead to a lot of disorganization, especially when creating something in the visual arts. So for this project, I'm using Milanote, who is also the sponsor of this video. Milanote is a digital whiteboard software that allows you to visually arrange notes, references, and different parts of project development. It's a great tool for organization and iteration, making it a great asset in terms of productive workflow. It also has features to let you share boards and work alongside other people, which is great for collaboration and project management. For my use case, Milanote helped me out a lot in terms of streamlining and organizing my development. It allowed me to create micro boards and charts within notes, as well as save images directly to any board I've created using its extension, which makes it super easy to neatly gather and arrange references. They also have templates that can make the note-taking process easy and productive in terms of time and presentation. You can sign up for Milanote for free with no time limit by following the link in the description. Starting my research, I began with organization. So I created a hub where all my different boards and info for development would be stored. This lets me quickly jump back and forth between more complex reference sheets without having things get too overwhelming or messy. Using this feature, I created different reference and development boards I would need for the different parts of this project. The first reference board I made was for characters. Since I'm starting from scratch on this story, I reflected on Nine Souls and similar games, and I found that characters were the thing that really drew me into the narrative, sometimes more than the world itself. So I wanted to reference characters I felt were appealing in both their story and design for different use cases of this project, and build the story from there. The characters in the final result will also aim to take inspiration from these, but have my own personal tastes and preferences make them into something more my own. Starting off, I made a board for main character references, in particular identifying characters I liked from different side-scrolling games to fit my genre. Yi from Nine Souls felt like an obvious place to start. His motivation for revenge and his change in character over the story from cold to more compassionate felt like a reference for a strong narrative. Him having a clear personality stood out to me as well. You weren't just playing a silent character that was a surrogate for yourself, you were playing as Yi and going through his story. This was something I felt was important for the revenge narrative to be successful, since Yi's motivation could really drive the plot forward with clear intention. I enjoy his design as well, in particular how stylistic it is. He has a very clear artistic imprint, something I feel really carries a lot of soul through the game. Mega Man Zero is a more nostalgic character for me, that I'd always enjoyed the design and most of his story. I feel the game's character designer, Toru Nakayama, has always had an impact on my work, being one of my larger artistic inspirations. Zero's stoic and sci-fi appearance I also felt could align well with Kyra's character. I also like where he starts in his story. Him being broken and seemingly on the edge of life felt like a compelling start to a narrative. Quote from Cave Story is a character in a similar case to Zero, starting in a broken/disheveled state. This low point felt like a great place to start a story in this kind of format, since it leaves a lot of room for character growth throughout the narrative. The robot soldier aesthetic I also found appealing, since it gave his character more depth and put him in more of a gray area in terms of ethics. This kind of complexity of Quote's character is something I felt made the story of Cave Story more compelling, so I found him a good example because of this. Additionally, I enjoy his design quite a bit as well. It feels really recognizable and striking with its contrasting colors. Copen from the Gunvolt and Luminous Avenger X series to me is a good example of a sleek and fast character, albeit without too much depth behind him. I was never a big fan of the story in these games, but his character design alongside the gameplay was always very appealing, and the high point of the experience for me. So I felt he was a good reference for just basic coolness in terms of design. Speaking of coolness, Spectre Knight is an expressly edgy character, as pointed out by many NPC in his spin-off game. This was another case of story I wasn't entirely invested in, and found him a rather shallow character, but enjoyed his motivation and design quite a bit. Him being bound to a contract and having to fulfill it out of a demonic obligation was a fun motivation. Basically another example of a cool and sleek character I think would be fun to use in this project. Finally, I thought I'd pay homage to one of the grandfathers of this genre and reference Alucard. The story of Symphony of the Night and Alucard is not one that I care too much for, but the ambience of that world is incredible. Additionally, I did like that Alucard was the son of the final boss. His personal connection in this way felt like a strong motivator and an interesting story point. I think the evil father trope is one that can carry a story pretty well, even without much exposition, especially since the concept of an evil parent is pretty pervasive in a lot of media. I also love the way Alucard is designed. His long cape, white hair, and yellow trimming along the edges of his coat, and overall gothic aesthetic I think work great for this format, since having a flashy character can help with visual clarity in this kind of game. Even though Kyra's design was already completed, I think many of these designs were on my mind when I was drawing her. I also find it helpful to reference these regardless, so that I have examples of protagonist characters to compare her to as I develop her further, especially in terms of narrative. With the protagonist reference figured out, I started gathering reference for both NPC and enemy characters. Even though the references so far had been for side-scroller games, I decided to reach a bit farther outside of the genre for these categories, reaching into other kinds of games and media. This is also where I started analyzing tropes of characters I was referencing. Something I said in my previous video was that I believe nothing is truly original, and that everything is derivative of something. So I think analyzing tropes can be an asset in terms of creation. For example, even though vampire characters have been in video games and other media before, it doesn't do Alucard a disservice that he is one. If anything, acknowledging that Alucard is a vampire allows the world and narrative to be sculpted around him in a more appealing way, paying homage to the appealing aspects of vampiric folklore and creating a feeling that may not have existed if he wasn't one. Analyzing tropes also lets you understand what kind of things you like or dislike from different media as well, and apply your taste more accurately in your own work. For example, I was contemplating on how I wanted the player progression to work, so I reflected on the progression tropes from games I'd played in the past. I realized that this had many times been allocated to a menu or crafting station, which was something I was fine with, but not anything I truly loved. I realized the kind I enjoyed the most, especially in terms of story context, was connected to a character type, a blacksmith. I enjoyed interactions with these kinds of characters not just because of the gameplay progression, but also because of the quips and small story elements that they would say when interacting with them. I felt these fleshed out the story in a non-intrusive way that I really enjoyed. So I realized this was a character type that I wanted in my story. one I felt was a great way of creating charm out of a necessary player interaction. Conversely, I dislike the trope of a narrative companion in games, like Navi in The Legend of Zelda, for example. It's just not a kind of character that I enjoy in this context, since I feel they kind of demystify a lot of the story and can feel a bit annoying or handholdy at times. I also feel they can often replace a narrative that can be filled with more situational dialogue that could be focusing on interacting with the different characters in the environment instead, and not monopolized by one character that is with you for the entirety of the experience. Also, just clarifying that this is my own personal taste and not me saying how other people should feel about this kind of character. This is my project as much it would be your project. So I think that your own opinions and taste should affect that. And in my case, I just don't really care for this type of character and wanted to intentionally avoid this trope. I then repeated this process, filling out the different boards with characters that I felt held a design, energy, or trope that I found appealing. I also referenced more broad sources like the NPCs in Hollow Knight as a whole, since I felt most were very fun, sometimes one-off experiences that fleshed out the world in a way I very much enjoyed. I also knew I wanted some fantasy monsters and beasts, so I referenced a few from software characters as well as some from the Ender games that stood out to me. I additionally looked outside of just video games, gathering some monster reference from Made in Abyss and Dimitsu Puzuka's work as well. Finally, I wanted to focus on the main bosses and use the Nine Souls, which for clarification is the name of the bosses in the game, Nine Souls, as the main reference for this. I felt they had a good amount of variety between them all, and for many reasons I stated before, they made sense to research them. I also included the 4 Guardians from Mega Man Zero, since I felt they were good examples of more involved characters in a side-scrolling narrative. I felt they had a good amount of variety and interactivity in the narrative between them all, as well as, on a more basic level, just finding their designs appealing. With character reference in a place that felt satisfying to me, I moved on to background and world reference. Here, I initially departed from video games as a major source, since I had an idea for some references that I felt would be better suited for what I was trying to do. For example, I gathered a variety of works by Shinji Kimura. Now, it's hard for me to talk about Shinji Kimura without detracting for a second, so I'm just gonna let myself ramble a little bit, but I think this man is genuinely an unsung master of the animation industry, at least in terms of his recognition in the West. His background art is full of so much detail, style, and passion. He gives a huge amount of life to the works he's a part of, with a style that feels very grungy, lived in, old, and worn out, but still brimming with life and texture. He is by far my favorite background artist, and whenever he is a part of a production, I make sure to go and see it. So I decided to use him as a primary reference for world building, especially for city environments. Secondly, I referenced Pozuka Dumitsu again. They are an artist whose worlds have so much color with a beautiful use of fantasy and perspective. I feel drawn in when looking at their work, and the simplicity of their line art is also so iconic to me in terms of their stylization, and it gives a character to their work that I honestly adore. Their color and rendering style is also equally amazing to me, since it gives so much depth and complexity and lighting to these scenes. I feel their work gives a snapshot into a narrative almost instantaneously. So with how much I admire their work, I knew I wanted to use them as a reference as well. After gathering a selection of these two artists' work, I decided to analyze between them what I found the most appealing and how I could apply it to my own work and world. This felt like a good start stylistically, but I wanted to reference games as well so that my boards had more direct references to use and compare if needed. I analyzed Cave Story, Nine Souls, the Ender games, and the Ori games as references to start. But comparing all of these, I found myself not entirely drawn to their aesthetic for one reason or another. Overall, I enjoyed these worlds in their respective contexts, but the art didn't completely resonate with me and what I wanted to make. So I dug a little deeper outside of the side-scroller genre to see if any other games felt like a fit, and I weirdly ended up coming to this game called Tiny Echo. I had played this game a while ago and enjoyed it, but long after finishing it, the attention to detail in the backgrounds really stayed with me. This is a very simple, top-down, point-and-click game, but with some of the most beautiful backgrounds I've seen in the 2D video game medium. The lived-in textural feeling with this mix of fantasy is something I found really satisfying while playing it. Even though this is a very different game from the others that I'm analyzing, I decided I really wanted to use it as a reference as well. This may be hard to describe, but even if it wasn't directly making tiny nature aesthetics or anything similar to what this game was doing, I wanted to see if I could capture its soul in some way and see if I could impart even just a little bit into this project somehow. I think that's what I like about Shinji Kimura and Pozuka Demitsu's work as well. There is a passion and life within it that I feel is really appealing. And because I felt so strongly about this during the research, I decided it was worth using. Also, just a tangential note, but I really do love this game. It's a short, sweet, relaxing experience, and I do recommend it to people that like that kind of game. Also, I'm going to platform quickly to say to Might and Delight, the developers of this game, please port this game to iPad. It's maybe something that not everybody agrees with, but I think that the point and click genre does fantastic with a touchscreen, and I think with a bit of polish that this game would be fantastic on there. I know it might be a little bit cheesy me saying all of this, but I guess I'm just saying it anyway. All right, getting back on track. Lastly, I wanted to figure out the world maps art. This is something traditionally not very common in 2D Metroidvanias, usually being very UI driven, but when it is that simplistic, I think it misses out on points of interest. For example, the map in Elden Ring has all these little details that made me as a player interested in exploring, something I felt was a bit devoid in Metroidvania maps, at least in terms of fun visual details instead of just, oh, this section is open and I haven't been here before. But I think a more traditional top-down map like Elden Ring's didn't make too much sense either. This game was a side-scroller at its heart, and I felt it needed something that fit that aesthetic better. After a bit of problem solving around this, I ended up deciding on a vertical world map for the concept. A spire-like landmass that extends vertically throughout the world, with a clear sense of bottom-to-top progression for the story and gameplay. I found a few good references that fit what I had in mind. For example, I found this representation of the Dark Souls map in this format that really appealed to me, as well as the maps from Hades and Made in Abyss. This one scene from Ender Magnolia had a bit of this feeling as well, so I decided to add it since it felt like it rounded out the map design reference quite well. From here, I felt I had a solid foundation in terms of world building reference and decided to move on to gameplay reference next. For this kind of reference, I began to really focus on what were some of the most satisfying side-scroller games I've played. This is a genre I'm very familiar with, having both negative and positive experiences with it, and reflecting, I realized that all my positive experiences involved a good use of speed, mobility, super meters, and a parrying system. To quickly define these, speed is about a character not feeling slow, feeling like they hold and maintain momentum through gameplay. Mobility works in tandem with speed, and when done right, gives a wide variety of options to maintain momentum and adjust to different gameplay situations. A super meter in this context is something that gains power through gameplay, creating a finite resource that can be used to trigger certain abilities for players to use. Ideally, this should be a satisfying build and release, working in tandem with the momentum of combat. Then a parrying system is a reaction and rhythm dependent mechanic that allows a player to block an attack. This channels the concept of risk and reward, allowing a player to block a move in a risky situation and be rewarded in some way after doing so. With these defined, I gathered resources from 2D action platformers that I felt held these values. Nine Souls' parry mechanic I think is the strongest part of the game, and the variety of different ways to do so work great. The talisman attacks are also a great use of super meter. I do feel in the end it is a slower paced game compared to others I'm referencing though, which is to its strength in its own game, but not necessarily what I think I want for this project in terms of speed reference. The Ixen Gunvolt games, starting with the second Gunvolt game, have great movement, especially with the character Copen. His ability to dash long distances, bounce off walls, and easily reposition are great references for mobility and speed. The only downside to Copen, I feel, is he needs more melee attacks to chain and keep momentum, as well as just variety in general. I feel some of his attacks can be a little bit stale. Gunvolt 3 does a really good job of keeping up this variety with the homing attacks and different directional movements and variety of characters, but I think still lacks more versatile ways to move and flow into other moves. Any of the attacks that have directional inputs in the Zero games, I feel have a great amount of versatility, and the variety of attack options during movement is pretty satisfying. I do think the game is comparatively a bit slow though, with a lot of time waiting and planning between boss attacks, but it's still a good historical base for this kind of character. Spectre of Torment's sliding and air dash attacks have a great use of speed and momentum, but I think the movements between combat and obstacles can sometimes feel a bit slow at times. But the best thing about this game, in my opinion, is the Judgment Rush, which is a fantastic way to maintain speed and increase mobility. Judgment Rush is also a great example of a panic button that allows you to save a character in a precarious situation or in a moment where you would lose momentum. Entropy Effect, I feel, is the game that gets closest to this criteria that I've established. I feel it's a fantastic game in terms of side-scroller action gameplay execution. It helps that there's a variety of characters that all operate a bit differently as well, but all of them can flow amazingly from move to move, build momentum, and have an incredible amount of maneuverability. The use of super meters is also done quite well, in my opinion, throughout this game, unlocking mid or high tier moves based off of how filled it is and the progression in the game, with an additional special meter that can be unlocked to allow you to use special ultimate moves as well. The only thing I feel is lacking is possibly more exploration into a parry mechanic. Hakumen and Jin have these, but I don't entirely enjoy their use cases since I feel like sometimes it's just a little bit more slow or situational, but the amount this game does right for me makes it a great reference. After gathering all these different references, I analyzed commonalities between them to see if there was any major takeaways. I mainly just kind of analyzed a lot of what I've talked about before, but there was a few extra things that were added on as well. With all these boards and references arranged and having analyzed them in terms of what I like from each respective source, I felt I was ready to move on to initial development for this project. When beginning development, you can start in a variety of places. It can be world building, a central refined theme, maybe focused on an aesthetic or something else. For my case, I felt character-driven narrative was the most appealing to me. So I decided to start by making NPC and enemy characters that would flesh out my world and build it up from there. Kyra gave me a great start in terms of style, allowing me to use her as a reference when making other characters. I also wrote a short blurb underneath Kyra just to put down some initial ideas I had and get the story started that way. After doing this, I added a log line with similar info to the main board, just to have a clear story reference that was easily accessible and something I could edit and kind of refine throughout the process. After getting the basics of the story started, I focused on the boss antagonist characters next, since I felt in a revenge narrative that they are the characters that really make a compelling story. Additionally, the medium I'm using is digital art, in particular the iPad. I'm a bit looser on the iPad and able to work in a variety of places, but also it helps that I can run Milanote in split screen mode while I work. This allows me to easily browse my references as well as quickly add to and update my boards as I make progress. This way I can work efficiently and be able to organize in real time even on the go. I wanted the antagonists in Kyra to have something in common, so I decided it made the most sense if they were all siblings. I find a compelling narrative in siblings connecting, competing, and challenging each other. I think it can also allow a clear motivation for characters without much explanation to the player. Most people know siblings can sometimes be at odds and fight, so it doesn't have to have heavy exposition to necessarily be believable. So I fleshed out designs and general story ideas for several sibling characters. I'll be honest, for most of these names, I tended to mismatch between ancient Sumerian, Celtic, and Latin words depending on who they were. And it's not necessarily the most thoughtful way to make a name for a character, and it can sometimes come off a bit cheesy, but I think I just wanted to explain my process for that. Next, I needed to make the main antagonist, and I decided to base it rather broadly on patriarchal antagonists. I wanted him to be a bit simple in his concept, at least for now, just to get the story moving. With these all figured out, there was only one more major character I needed to make: the witch. To explain a bit more, throughout this process, I started to refine the story of Kyra and the world itself. And I knew that I basically wanted her to feel completely dejected and thrown out of the world she previously lived in, and be literally disarmed by having her arms cut off and thrown into the abyss of this world. This would put her at a very low point and a place where I think the game would be very interesting to start at and allow a lot of growth for her going forward. So at the start of the game, my goal was to have Kyra basically brimming with this animosity for her family and for everything that had been going on and within the depths of this world meet a witch who very similarly has a vendetta against those above. And they together basically become Kyra's final design with the ghostly, wraith-like witch hands. So I knew I wanted to make the witch's design a little bit more interesting and kind of over the top and kind of feel very defined in this world. Once I got her design in a good place and reflecting on all the different story points I'd created with the other antagonists, I felt confident enough to start branching into other parts of development, including world building. I began with the vertical map concept and just started building ideas out from there. I began jumping back and forth between the character and world building boards. Sometimes I would create places and make a character to fit into them, and sometimes I would make a character that I needed to make a place for. Going back and forth like this helped me really build momentum and establish the world more and more, as well as keep consistent progress by focusing on what I was interested in from the moment to moment time. For example, I love the little monsters on old maps, so I started putting little monsters all around and then made designs and stories for them afterwards. I also took notes whenever I had an idea for how an area could fit into the story, as well as adding to a timeline of events in the history of that world. This was another very helpful feature of Milanote. Being able to arrange notes in chronological order with all my information clearly organized and easily accessible was extremely useful while world building. After working for a while though, this all started to feel a little bit too stale, and I could tell I was hitting a bit of a block in terms of certain story points. So instead of pushing myself unnecessarily, I shifted focus to other things I could do. For example, I wanted to do a logo for this project, so I did a lot of iterations for that between the art and story work. Though the title I chose in the end was a bit simplistic, I chose Witch Fist as the name for this project. Though after choosing it and finishing this project, I also looked it up online, and apparently it's also the name of a heavy metal punk band. They don't seem to have been active since 2023, but for clarity's sake, I guess I'll just say that this project doesn't have any association with them. Now, as much as I am a visual artist, I will say that graphic design is truly not my passion. It's something I don't have a lot of experience with, so I knew for this I would need to work smart. I started by gathering references and trying different things out. Milanote helps a lot with this kind of iterative process, allowing me to quickly take notes on my design and reflect on the visual progression of my work. I also used its color card tool to try out a few different palettes to see what made the most sense. In the end, I chose to use green and blue since they were in Kyra's design. When I finished it, I felt reasonably happy with the final design I had in the end, or at least happy with it with my minimal experience in graphic design in mind. Doing this kind of hopping between things let my brain rest creatively and allowed me to problem solve significantly easier when I returned to different boards. I found that when I would come back to writing or to different characters, I would find myself feeling less creatively blocked as a whole. Another additional task I focused on was game design. I wanted to keep things pretty loose in terms of what gameplay would be for now, since this is just an initial development project. This isn't me fully fleshing out or really creating a final idea. This is me kind of testing out and trying to create a foundation that I can then improve upon later. So for now, I decided to mainly focus on the character moveset. Since how the character moves and interacts in the world is a major part of the experience, I felt solidifying that would be a good focus for this project. I made a board, a column for statuses, imported some button icons for inputs using Xbox 360 controller for reference, since I felt it would be fun, and made a document file where I wrote out some notes for how I would approach character movement and abilities. I then refined this document into a checklist and made my tasks a bit more clear. I made a pretty simplistic sketch rendition of Kyra for this section to then animate all the possible moves to. My intention here was to keep this process pretty fast and simple, treating it as animated notes and sketches for what I think could work. I then built out the different movements, attacks, and upgrades from here. Through this process, I was basically thinking back on all the different character movements from the games in my references and deciding which I liked the most and could fit the character best in this game. I then tried to adapt or change things to more of my preferences, making things more my own in the process. While doing this though, I did hit a point of reflection. Especially in a limited medium like this, it's hard to truly break the mold. Not to say it can't be done, but I realized if I were to focus on that too much, I also would lose focus on this project. I wanted to pay homage to the characters I enjoyed and attempt to combine all these separate parts into something personalized to me and my tastes. I do think in the end a decent amount of these ideas felt derivative, but I also think, especially in the video game industry, everyone is referencing and iterating off of each other. Pretty much all of the things I was referencing themselves were referencing or doing something that had been done before, and I think that's part of the reason I enjoy them so much. All these games had improvement and homage to what had come before. So in the end, I feel I'm alright in doing this, especially if it's just rudimentary sketches and ideas, but if the project were to continue onwards, I would want to put more effort into making sure I was truly adapting and not just copying from my sources. After bouncing back and forth for a while, I eventually found myself satisfied with the narrative, visuals, and mechanics for how I would start this project. And I could see a clear direction to further development. To finish this off though, I thought a cinematic storyboard would be a great final result to kind of bookend this concept so far, as well as really nail the beginning of the story. I used a template to help start my boards and flesh out the rough idea on how the game's intro would begin. Then from there, I cleaned up the concept and added a bit of cinematic editing.
From this day forth, you are banished to the lower lands. You are to never return. Think of this as kindness, one you are not truly owed. What a disappointment. What a waste of potential. You could have been.
Enough. I've had enough of this. I will burn your city and personally slaughter each and every one of...
Goodbye, Kyra.
I had a lot of fun with this project in general, so I decided to even further just make a few different concept art pieces using the characters and environments that I'd created for this project. Though this is just kind of more additional work, this still adds that initial narrative and visual identity for the project. With all these parts together, I felt as though I made a really solid launch pad to adapt this into a more complete project in the future. This was a very satisfying project for me, one that I really enjoyed and could definitely see myself continuing more in the future. But the point of this video is not to tell you how to make a specific game, it's to show you how I approach the process of beginning something. You can apply this idea of references and conceptualization to pretty much anything creative, personalizing it to yourself and your own goals and aspirations. The point of this was to show how I would make something using this general workflow that I think can work for most other creative projects as well. This kind of attention to what you're making can make you more conscious of your inspirations and create clarity on what you want to make and how you want to make it. This process can also be easily scaled down to smaller projects. I mainly chose a larger project as an example for this because I wanted to show off how it can work for the beginnings of something more complex. But in the end, I hope this video gives you a bit more clarity into a way to begin a project if you've been having trouble finding a way to do so, and gives you a good amount of direction in terms of development. Anyways, if you've sat through this video to the end, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again very soon.